The lights were blinding, the crowd restless, and a 5-year-old boy stood center stage. Barefoot, trembling, staring into the unknown. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not tonight, not yet. His brothers had rehearsed for weeks. They were the performers, the Jackson brothers. He was the quiet one, the one who watched from the shadows, clutching his mother's dress whenever the music got too loud. But something strange had happened in the hours before this moment, something that would change not just this night, but the course of music history. Michael's small hands were shaking. The old wooden stage beneath his feet creaked as he shifted nervously. He could feel his father's eyes burning through him from the side of the room, sharp, expectant, unblinking. Behind the curtain, his brothers whispered and laughed, not out of cruelty but disbelief. Can he really do it? He's too scared. He's gonna mess it up. Their words echoed in his tiny mind like thunder. He wanted to run. He wanted to hide. But the music was about to start, and there was no turning back. The microphone stood taller than him. The smell of dust and sweat filled the air. The small crowd in Gary, Indiana, a mix of families, workers, and neighbors, waited, unimpressed. They didn't know that history was about to whisper its first note. A boy who could barely tie his shoes was about to tie the world to a rhythm it would never forget. And yet, at that exact moment, Michael wasn't thinking about greatness. He was thinking about the floor beneath his feet, about how cold it was, how rough it felt against his bare skin. He hadn't even meant to walk out barefoot. It was an accident, a forgotten pair of shoes backstage in the rush and fear. But that mistake would become symbolic of everything that defined him. Raw, exposed, vulnerable, and yet unstoppable. The spotlight hit. The music began, and for a breathless moment, he froze. Then something inside him, something ancient, untamed, divine, rose to the surface. When Michael opened his mouth to sing, time itself seemed to pause. The voice that emerged didn't sound like a 5-year-old's. It sounded like a story being told by someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes, soft yet commanding, innocent yet knowing, fragile yet fierce. The laughter stopped. The whispers died. And in that silence, a legend was born. But what no one knew that night, what even Michael didn't know, was that he wasn't supposed to be the one singing at all. That role, that spotlight, that destiny, belonged to someone else. Until fate, or perhaps something greater, decided to rewrite the script. And that rewrite began long before that stage light ever found his face. Before the moonwalk, before the thriller jacket, before the world screamed his name, there was Gary, a gray, industrial town wrapped in the smoke of steel factories and the cries of survival. This was no place for dreams. Dreams here rusted like metal, forgotten under the weight of bills, exhaustion, and broken promises. At 2300 Jackson Street, 9 children shared a 2-bedroom house. Their mother, Catherine, was the warmth in the chaos, a gentle voice, a gospel hum that floated through the noise. Their father, Joseph, was something else entirely, sharp, disciplined, and driven by a storm that never slept. He worked long hours in the mill, hands cracked and scarred by steel. But when the day ended, he traded his tools for a guitar, gathering his sons to rehearse under the flickering light bulb in the living room. Music wasn't just passion, it was escape. Joseph saw it as the only way out. The only chance to pull his family out of Gary's shadow. And so, the Jackson brothers were born. They sang in local clubs, school gyms, and talent shows. The boys, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and Marlon, learned rhythm the way most kids learned to walk. Every note was practiced, every mistake corrected, every performance a chance to survive. In that cramped home, music was both a gift and a weapon. Joseph's temper could strike as quickly as his guitar strings. Perfection wasn't a request. It was a demand. And in the corner, away from the spotlight, sat little Michael. He wasn't rehearsing. He wasn't performing. He was watching. He watched every move, every step, every note that slipped out of his brothers' mouths. He mimicked their dance steps in silence, copying the exact rhythm when no one was looking. Catherine noticed. She'd find him singing to himself, lost in a world of sound only he could hear. But Joseph didn't see it, at least not yet. To him, Michael was just the baby. Too young, too fragile, too soft for the stage. And yet, something about the way Michael listened, truly listened, was different. He wasn't just hearing the music. He was understanding it, feeling it, living it. The walls of that tiny home vibrated with dreams and discipline. But no one, not even Joseph, could sense that the smallest voice in that room was about to become the loudest echo in history. Because sometimes, greatness doesn't announce itself, it hides, waiting for the right moment to be forced into the light. The Jackson brothers were starting to make a name for themselves. They played anywhere they could, high school gyms, smoky bars, local talent shows. People began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, this family from Gary had something special. But to Michael, it was still a world he could only watch from the sidelines. He'd sit cross-legged near the stage, wide-eyed, absorbing every note. He knew all their songs by heart. Every lyric, every harmony, every move. And one evening, during a small rehearsal in their living room, destiny slipped quietly through the door. Tito was practicing a song, one he'd sung dozens of times before. But that night, he missed a lyric. He stumbled, confused for a second. Before anyone could correct him, a tiny voice from the corner spoke up. Soft, clear, confident. "That's not how it goes," the voice said. Everyone turned. It was Michael, the youngest, the quiet one, the one who was never supposed to interrupt. Joseph's eyes narrowed. "Sing it then," he said flatly. A challenge. A test. Michael hesitated. His brothers giggled. He stood up slowly, heart pounding, voice trembling. Then, without warning, he sang. The sound that came out froze the room. It wasn't just accurate, it was soulful, effortless, powerful. Every note landed perfectly. Every emotion, real. Catherine, listening from the kitchen, stopped what she was doing. She knew in that instant something extraordinary had awakened. When the song ended, the silence was heavy. Even Joseph didn't speak for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, "Do it again." And Michael did. And again, each time more confident, more alive. It was as if the music had been waiting inside him all along, just looking for permission to escape. From that night on, Michael was no longer the boy in the corner. He was part of the rehearsals, reluctantly at first, then regularly. Joseph pushed him harder than anyone. He saw in Michael something terrifying, limitless potential, but with that discovery came pressure. The next performance would no longer feature 4 brothers. It would feature 5, and the smallest one would stand front and center. The Jackson brothers were evolving, becoming something new. But change, especially in a family, always comes with a cost. His brothers felt it first, the shift. The attention that used to be theirs was now being pulled toward Michael. He was too young, too small, too untested, and yet somehow, everyone's eyes went to him. Some nights, Jermaine would tease him, calling him the baby star. Other times, Tito would shake his head and say, "You better not mess this up." Michael laughed it off, but inside, fear was tightening its grip. He didn't want to steal the spotlight. He just wanted to sing. But Joseph had made up his mind. The next show was in a local community hall, a small stage, maybe 50 people. The Jackson brothers would perform, with Michael leading. The rehearsals were brutal. Joseph demanded perfection, stopping them after every missed note. Michael's voice cracked from exhaustion, but he didn't complain. Because deep down, he wasn't just singing for applause. He was singing to prove he belonged. The night before the performance, Catherine found him awake in bed, whispering the lyrics under his breath. She knelt beside him and said softly, "You'll be fine, baby. Just sing with your heart." He nodded, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was terrified. Outside, the wind howled against the windows of their tiny home in Gary. Inside, a storm of a different kind was gathering. Because the next night, a 5-year-old boy would walk onto a stage for the first time, and the world would never be the same again. The night arrived. The community hall was buzzing with chatter, the air thick with the scent of popcorn, sweat, and cheap cologne. Families, factory workers, neighbors, everyone had gathered for the weekend show. Backstage, Michael clutched the edge of a curtain, peeking through the small gap. The lights hurt his eyes even from a distance. The hall looked enormous to him, a sea of strange faces waiting for entertainment. He had never stood before so many people. His brothers tuned their instruments, their laughter hiding their own nerves. Joseph paced behind them like a general before battle. His voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Remember the steps. No mistakes tonight. Especially you, Michael," the boy nodded, barely breathing. He hadn't eaten all day. Fear had stolen his appetite. His small hands were slick with sweat. He rubbed them against his pants, trying to stop the shaking. Then he noticed something: his shoes. He'd left them by the door of their dressing room. Before he could run back to get them, Joseph barked, "You're up! Move!" There was no time. No turning back. Michael took one last breath as the curtains began to open. The crowd clapped half-heartedly, not expecting much. Just another local family act, another group of hopefuls chasing small-town applause. But behind that curtain stood something they could never predict: a trembling child about to collide with destiny, the bee. Music started, a familiar rhythm they'd practiced for weeks. His brothers stepped forward, confident and synchronized. Michael froze. The spotlight hit him. The crowd saw a barefoot little boy in a neatly ironed shirt, standing too still, too frightened to move. His heart pounded so loud it drowned out the music. Every second stretched into eternity. He could feel Joseph's eyes stabbing into his back. The words echoed in his head, "Don't mess up. Don't embarrass me." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat locked. His mind went blank. For a split second, he thought about running off stage. He thought about disappearing forever, hiding behind Catherine's arms. And then, from somewhere deep inside, a small whisper spoke to him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. But it said one word: sing. He took another breath, and he did. The sound was shaky at first, almost a whisper. But then his voice began to rise, steady, round, alive. The fear in his chest started to melt into something else. Something powerful. He remembered Catherine's words, "Sing with your heart." So he did. As his brothers played, Michael began to move without thinking. His feet, bare against the cold wooden floor, tapped to the rhythm. His hands lifted slightly, then fell in time with the beat. His voice found its power. The crowd went silent. They hadn't expected this. Not from a 5-year-old. Not from this child who could barely reach the microphone. Joseph's stern face shifted, just slightly. Surprise flashing for the first time. By the second verse, the silence in the hall had turned to awe. The child who moments ago seemed frozen was now commanding the entire room, and Michael felt it too. Something inside him had awakened. Something that didn't feel human, didn't feel small. It felt infinite. He was no longer scared. He wasn't even thinking about the crowd. He was somewhere else. In the rhythm, in the sound, in the story of the song. His brothers glanced at him, almost forgetting their own parts. They had never seen him like this. The smallest one had become the center. The audience clapped before the song even ended. And when it did, the sound of applause roared like thunder. Michael stood frozen again, but this time in disbelief. He hadn't expected that sound. He hadn't expected love. Behind him, Joseph gave a single nod. Not a smile, not a word of praise, just a nod. But to Michael, that tiny gesture meant everything. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. For the first time, he felt like he mattered, and that's when something else stirred inside him. Something more dangerous than fear. The taste of validation. The thrill of applause. The birth of need. From that night on, Michael wouldn't just chase music. He'd chase that feeling. That moment when the world finally looked his way. The performance was over, but his heart wouldn't stop racing. He could still hear the crowd, still see the lights, still feel the floor under his bare feet, and yet, even in that victorious silence, there was a shadow growing behind him, a shadow named ambition, because what began as a miracle on a small-town stage was about to become an obsession that would consume everything that followed, and the boy who conquered fear tonight had no idea what price that courage would cost him. The applause didn't fade. It rolled through the small hall like a wave that refused to break. People stood, clapping, cheering, shouting his name, but Michael barely heard it. His heart was still thundering in his chest. He didn't know whether to smile, to bow, to cry. His brothers patted his shoulder as they walked off stage, half proud, half stunned. Backstage, Joseph said nothing at first. He just looked at his son and really looked, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice colder than expected, he said, "Don't ever freeze again. You got lucky," and walked away. The thrill inside Michael cracked instantly. The applause still echoed in the distance, but it no longer felt like victory. It felt like a debt, something he now owed the world, owed his father, owed himself. Catherine found him sitting quietly a few minutes later. He was still barefoot, staring at his hands. She smiled softly and said, "You were wonderful, baby." He didn't respond right away. Finally, he whispered, "Mama, did I do good?" She pulled him close. "You did more than good. You made people feel something." Her words sank deep into his heart. He didn't fully understand them, but they stayed, because that was the truth about Michael. Even as a child, he didn't just want to perform. He wanted to make people feel. That night, back home, he couldn't sleep. The sounds of the crowd replayed in his mind like a song he couldn't stop hearing. Every cheer, every clap, it looped endlessly. But beneath it all, he remembered the silence that came before it, that terrifying moment when he stood frozen in front of everyone, when the whole world felt like it was holding its breath. That silence haunted him, because inside that silence he had faced everything, his fear, his doubt, his worth. And though he'd conquered it once, he knew he'd face it again, every time he walked on stage for the rest of his life. The next morning, Joseph gathered the boys in the living room. "No congratulations, no celebration. Just rehearsal, again," he said. "We've got another show next weekend. And this time, no mistakes," Michael sang, voice raw from exhaustion. When he missed a note, Joseph stopped him with a glare. "Do it again," he ordered, and again. And again. The family could see it. Something had shifted. The performance had changed Joseph, too. He'd tasted success through his youngest son, and now he wanted more. What began as a father's dream of escaping poverty was turning into something harsher: control. For Michael, music had felt like freedom on that stage. But in this living room, it was turning into a chain. Still, he never protested. He sang harder. He moved sharper. He didn't want to lose the feeling of that applause, the proof that he was good enough. At 5 years old, he began to learn the cruelest lesson in entertainment: that love can sound a lot like pressure, and applause can echo like chains. Yet even as the weight grew heavier, the spark inside him refused to fade. Late at night, when everyone else slept, he'd whisper melodies to himself, soft, sweet, untouched by fear. He didn't know why he did it. He just knew it felt right, as if some invisible force was guiding him, shaping him, preparing him for something greater. Years later, when he looked back on that first night, he would describe it with one word: magic. But the truth is, that magic was born from struggle, from the silence, from the fear, from a barefoot boy who almost didn't sing. That silence defined him. Because every performance after that, every concert, every tour, he carried it with him. The heartbeat before the first note, the trembling before the roar. He lived in that moment, half terrified, half alive, and maybe that's what made him who he was, a performer who could only find peace when the music began. That night in Gary, Indiana, ended with cheers and pride, but for Michael, it also began a quiet war, a war between the child who wanted to play and the prodigy the world demanded he become. He didn't know it yet, but the next stage he'd step onto wouldn't be in a small town. It would be in front of the world, and the silence before that song would be louder than ever. Because once you've heard the sound of a crowd loving you, you'll do anything to hear it again. The next weekend, the Jackson brothers returned to that same community hall. But this time something was different. The crowd was larger, the whispers louder. Word had spread across Gary. There was a little boy who could sing like no one else. A voice too big for his size, too emotional for his age. Michael didn't understand what all the attention meant. He just knew people expected something from him now, and expectations frightened him more than the stage itself. Before the show, he stood quietly behind the curtain, humming softly to calm himself. His brothers were confident, joking, ready to perform. But Michael? He was listening. Listening for the rhythm, the energy, the pulse of the crowd. He'd learned something powerful from his first performance. That music wasn't just sound. It was connection. And when that connection happened, time seemed to stop. The lights rose. The curtain lifted. This time he didn't freeze. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked inward, and the music took over. The song began. And from the very first note, the room fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Every ear, every heart was fixed on that tiny barefoot boy with a microphone almost as tall as he was. Michael's voice flowed like something sacred, smooth, raw, pure. It wasn't just the sound of talent. It was the sound of truth. Each lyric seemed to pour straight from his soul, and the audience could feel it. This wasn't imitation. This wasn't mimicry. This was something divine, an emotion too big for a child, too deep to fake. Even Joseph, watching from the side, stood still. His stern face didn't soften, but something in his eyes shifted. Awe, maybe even fear. He realized his son wasn't just gifted. He was extraordinary. Catherine sat in the front row, tears gathering in her eyes. She didn't see a performer. She saw a calling. The music swelled, and Michael's body moved instinctively. Each step, each gesture carried a rhythm of its own, as though he were being guided by something invisible. He didn't plan it. He didn't think it. He just felt it. People gasped, clapped mid-song, even shouted his name. The applause broke through verses, but he didn't stop. He was lost in the rhythm, consumed by it. It wasn't just singing anymore. It was storytelling. By the time the song ended, the hall erupted. People stood on chairs, cheering, clapping, shouting. They had never seen anything like it, and in that roaring sea of sound, Michael smiled. For the first time, it wasn't fear or duty driving him. It was joy. But as the applause went on, he noticed something strange. Joseph wasn't clapping. He was watching, measuring, calculating. The crowd's reaction wasn't pride in his eyes. It was potential. A door had opened, and he saw more than music. He saw opportunity. That night, as they packed up, Joseph said little. But later, when everyone was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table, staring into space. His calloused hands rested on his guitar. He whispered to himself, "The boy's special. Different. We can make something with this." And so, the next morning, the rehearsals changed. The laughter faded. The casual practices became grueling sessions. Michael's brothers looked confused. "What's gotten into Dad?" But Michael knew. The applause had awakened something in his father, and it wasn't love. It was ambition. He was no longer just training a group of boys to sing. He was molding an empire, and at the center of it all was a 5-year-old child. That night before bed, Michael asked Catherine, "Mama, why does Daddy never smile when I sing?" She paused before answering, brushing his curls from his forehead. "Because sometimes, baby," she said softly, "people see a blessing." And mistake it for a burden. Her words hung heavy in the air. Michael didn't understand them then, but years later he would, because that night of glory, that moment when his voice silenced a crowd, didn't just make him a star. It chained him to expectation. The same silence that had terrified him once now became the thing he feared losing. He would chase it forever, the stillness before the applause, the breath before the roar, and while the world would soon know his name, Michael Jackson. The boy inside him, the one who sang Barefoot and Trembling, would slowly begin to disappear, because the night his voice conquered fear was the same night it surrendered freedom. The next few months moved fast, too fast for a 5-year-old to understand. Joseph was now obsessed. He booked more shows, arranged more practices, pushed harder each day. He began introducing the boys to tougher songs, longer sets, bigger audiences. And Michael? He obeyed. He sang, danced, performed, and impressed everyone who saw him. But behind every performance was pressure. If he missed a step, Joseph's belt snapped. If he forgot a lyric, the room went silent until he got it right. Praise was rare. Fear was constant. And through that fear, perfection was born. Michael began to see music differently. It wasn't play anymore. It was survival. Every note, every move, it had to be flawless. The rehearsals stretched into late nights. His small body grew tired, but his mind couldn't rest. He wanted to make his father proud, to see a smile, a word, anything that proved he was enough. But approval never came. Joseph's voice echoed through every practice. Again. Do it right. Better. Michael sang until his throat ached, danced until his feet blistered, cried quietly when no one was looking. And through that pain, something remarkable and tragic was happening. He was becoming unstoppable. When he performed, fear no longer controlled him. Instead, it fueled him. The same trembling that had once paralyzed him now gave his performances their edge. That intensity, that fire, that desperate need to be perfect. People around Gary started calling him a little genius. But geniuses, especially young ones, are rarely free. The Jackson family began to rise. They started winning local competitions, catching the attention of people far beyond Gary. Every show brought new opportunities, but also deeper cracks within the family. Jermaine felt the shift most. He was the oldest singer, once the frontman. Now he stood slightly behind, harmonizing with the boy who stole the spotlight without trying. Jealousy brewed quietly, but Michael didn't see it. He didn't notice the whispers, the sighs, the way his brother's smiles sometimes faded when people praised him first. He was too busy trying to please their father, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to hold the dream together. Because even then, Michael Jackson wasn't just a performer. He was a healer, always trying to bring peace even when he was the reason it shattered. One night, after a long rehearsal, Joseph looked at him and said, "You're the reason people listen." "Don't ever forget that," Michael smiled faintly, not realizing what those words truly meant. It wasn't encouragement. It was ownership. From that moment, control became the rhythm of his life. Joseph dictated everything: when to rehearse, when to eat, what to wear, what to feel. And the more the world loved Michael's voice, the tighter Joseph's grip became. It was love mixed with fear, pride twisted with possession. A dangerous combination, one that would follow Michael for decades. But the boy didn't see it that way. Not yet. He thought this was how greatness worked. He thought pain was the price of excellence. And maybe, in some ways, he was right, because out of that pressure came something extraordinary. A discipline, a sound, a precision the world had never heard before. Michael began crafting his timing, his emotion, his storytelling through song. Even at 5, he sang like someone who knew pain, not just mimicked it. It was as if he was channeling the voices of those who'd lived 100 lives before him. Catherine watched him closely. She could see both wonder and worry in equal measure. Her son's eyes had changed. They no longer sparkled with the innocence of play. They burned with purpose. One evening, she sat with him while he practiced softly to himself, whispering lyrics under his breath. She asked, "Why do you keep singing, baby? Even when no one's listening?" He looked up, his eyes wide and serious. "Because, Mama," he said, "when I sing, I feel like I'm not scared anymore." That line, simple, pure, heartbreaking, captured everything that made Michael who he was. Singing wasn't a performance for him. It was escape. It was therapy. It was home, but that same voice, that same power that freed him on stage, was slowly building invisible walls around him off stage. Walls made of expectations, control, and the haunting need to be perfect. Every single time. The barefoot boy from Gary had become something else entirely, a prodigy molded by love, fear, and the relentless hunger to prove himself. And as the family began to outgrow their little town, the whispers started reaching further, past Indiana, past Chicago, toward something bigger. Motown producers, auditions, a chance at the dream that Joseph had always wanted and that Michael could no longer escape. But before the world could meet the king of pop, the child inside him would have to surrender everything, because every legend begins with a sacrifice. And Michael's had already begun. Success came quickly, but harmony within the Jackson household began to fracture. The brothers were now local celebrities. They performed at talent shows, school events, and even small clubs. The Jackson Five were becoming a name that people remembered. But as crowds grew, something else began to grow too. Resentment. It started quietly. A glance here, a silence there. Jermaine, once the group's voice, found himself harmonizing behind his little brother. Marlon and Tito noticed it too. How Joseph's eyes followed only Michael during rehearsals. How every compliment, every correction was directed at him. It wasn't that Michael wanted the spotlight. He never asked for it. But the spotlight chose him, and it refused to let go. Every performance made it clearer. When Michael sang, the audience erupted. When the others sang, the applause faded quickly. After one show, Jermaine threw his guitar onto the couch. "What's the point, man? It's always Michael this and Michael that. We're just background singers now." Jackie tried to calm him. "He's just a kid, Jermaine. He doesn't even realize it." But Jermaine's jaw tightened. "That's the problem. He doesn't realize anything. He just smiles, sings, and takes everything." Michael heard those words from the hallway. He stood frozen, barefoot again, that same fear from his first stage creeping back. He wanted to be part of his brothers, not above them. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of their argument played in his head. He began to wonder, maybe his voice wasn't a gift. Maybe it was a curse that tore them apart. But in the morning, Joseph acted as though nothing had happened. "Show tonight," he said gruffly. "We leave after breakfast." Michael looked at his brothers. They nodded, but their smiles were gone. On stage, they performed perfectly. No one would have known what was happening behind the scenes. But Michael could feel the tension in every move, every harmony. During one song, he turned to smile at Jermaine. But Jermaine didn't smile back. The crowd cheered louder than ever, yet Michael felt emptier than before. It was his dream coming true, and somehow it felt wrong. The next day, while practicing, Joseph stopped the band mid-song. "No, Michael, take that line again. You didn't hit it clean." Jermaine spoke up quietly. "Dad, it was fine." Joseph turned to him. "Did I ask you?" The air froze. Jermaine's lips tightened, but he said nothing more. Michael sang the line again, this time flawless. Joseph nodded. That's how you do it. But in that silence, something inside Jermaine cracked. Later, while walking home, he muttered under his breath, "He's not even trying. He just opens his mouth and gets all the praise." And that became the quiet truth in their family, the truth no one spoke aloud. The Jackson Five were becoming great, but they were also becoming divided. Jealousy was the unspoken rhythm beneath every beat, every rehearsal, every applause. Yet Michael, too young to understand adult pride, responded the only way he knew how, by trying harder. He danced sharper, sang stronger, smiled wider, hoping to make everyone proud. But in doing so, he only made the gap wider. Catherine saw it happening. She tried to hold the family together with kindness and faith. "Your brothers love you," she told Michael one night. Michael looked down. "Then why don't they look at me anymore?" She couldn't answer, because deep down, even she feared what fame was doing to them, to him. And still, Joseph kept pushing. He didn't care about feelings. He cared about results. To him, jealousy was fuel, not fire. "Let them compete," he'd say. That's how diamonds are made, but he was wrong. Diamonds may shine under pressure, but they also cut deep. As the brothers' resentment grew, so did their reputation. Local clubs weren't enough anymore. A scout had seen them at a show and mentioned something that changed everything. "There's a place in Detroit. Motown Records. They're looking for young talent." Joseph's eyes lit up. The dream that once seemed impossible suddenly had a direction. But as he planned their next move, Michael sat by the window that night, staring at the dark streets of Gary. The cheers of the crowd echoed faintly in his mind, but so did Jermaine's voice. "It's always Michael this and Michael that," he whispered to himself. "Maybe if I sing better, they'll stop hating me." That small sentence, innocent, desperate, heartbreaking, would define his entire life. Because from that moment on, Michael Jackson didn't just perform to be loved by the world. He performed to be loved by the ones who'd known him before the world did. And no applause, no record, no stadium could ever fill that silent space. Winter came, and with it, the beginning of something extraordinary. Joseph loaded their instruments into the car and told the boys, "We're going to Detroit. It's time people who matter heard you." The drive was long, cold, and filled with nervous silence. Michael looked out the window, watching the snow-covered fields pass by. He didn't know what Motown was, but from the way his father spoke, it sounded like destiny. When they arrived, Detroit was alive with sound. Soul music pulsed through every radio. Names like Smokey Robinson, The Temptations, and The Supremes filled the air. Motown wasn't just a record label. It was a kingdom. And Joseph had brought his sons to its gates. Their first audition wasn't official. It was in a small room before a man named Bobby Taylor, one of Motown's singers. Joseph introduced them, rough and direct. "These are my boys. They can out-sing anyone you got." Bobby smiled politely. "All right, let's hear them." The brothers set up nervously. Michael adjusted his small mic stand, looking down at his shoes, the same worn pair he'd practiced in for months. When the music started, it was electric. Michael's voice burst through the air, soulful and powerful beyond his years. Bobby Taylor's smile vanished. By the second chorus, he leaned forward, whispering, "That's the one, that little one. He's the real deal." When they finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Bobby stood up, eyes wide. "You kids are something special. I'm calling Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, the man who created legends." In that instant, Joseph's face lit up with a pride no one had ever seen before. He shook Bobby's hand hard. "You'll see. These boys are going to make history." But for Michael, the moment was overwhelming. Everyone was talking, excited, loud, happy, but he felt like the world was spinning too fast. He looked around and realized this wasn't just a family dream anymore. It was a business, a machine, and he was standing in the center of it. Back at the motel that night, while everyone celebrated, Michael sat quietly on the bed. Catherine noticed. "What's wrong, baby?" He whispered. "What if they don't like me next time?" She hugged him tightly. "Then you sing again and again. Because your gift doesn't depend on who listens, it comes from who you are." Those words comforted him, but only for a moment. Because the next morning, Joseph was already preparing for another rehearsal. "Berry Gordy won't sign no sloppy act," he barked. "We're doing it till it's perfect." The sessions grew harder, the stakes higher, and for the first time, Michael felt something new, exhaustion mixed with destiny. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing on the edge of history. That small boy from Gary, the one who once sang Barefoot and Terrified, was about to step into the biggest stage of his life. But there was one more test waiting when they finally got the call to audition for Berry Gordy himself. Everything came down to that moment. The brothers stood in a polished Motown office, lights bright, instruments ready. Berry Gordy sat in front of them, calm, analytical, expressionless. Joseph gave a nod. The music began. Michael closed his eyes, took a breath, and sang. All the fear, all the pain, all the pressure, it poured into his voice. And something miraculous happened. Berry Gordy's stoic expression melted into astonishment. He whispered to his assistant, "He's not just a singer. He's a phenomenon." When the song ended, silence filled the room. Then Barry stood up slowly and said, "Welcome to Motown." It was done. The Jackson 5 were signed, and the world, though it didn't know it yet, was about to change forever. But as everyone celebrated, Michael looked down at his small hands, trembling. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was excitement. Maybe it was fear. Because somewhere deep inside, he sensed that from this day forward, his life would never be his own again. The barefoot boy who once sang to escape fear had now entered a world where fear would become his companion. And in that quiet moment, while his family cheered around him, one thought echoed in his young heart. "I didn't choose this. It chose me." The world had just met Michael Jackson, but the child who once sang Barefoot in Gary was already beginning to fade into legend. And the legend was only just beginning to rise. Detroit didn't sleep, especially not Motown. Within weeks of signing, the Jackson 5 were thrown into a whirlwind: rehearsals, recordings, choreography, interviews. It was a dream come true, but one that came with a cost. Michael was only 10 years old now, barely tall enough to reach the studio microphones without a stool. Yet everyone around him treated him like an adult, like a star in the making. Berry Gordy saw it immediately. Michael wasn't just talented, he was magnetic. That rare kind of performer whose voice carried both innocence and pain. A voice that could move anyone, anywhere. "Keep your eyes on the little one," Berry said. "He's lightning in a bottle," and Joseph made sure that bottle never cracked. Every morning began with drills, singing scales, practicing dance steps, repeating harmonies until they blended like one voice. There was no play, no rest, no laughter. Motown's choreographers demanded perfection, and Joseph demanded even more. If they weren't working in the studio, they were working at home. And through it all, Michael smiled. He always smiled. No one saw how tired he was, how his feet ached, how his voice sometimes broke from exhaustion. Because when he performed, he didn't just sing. He became something else. On stage, the pain disappeared. The fear vanished. It was replaced by something electric, a joy that only existed under the spotlight. The first single came out, "I Want You Back." The world exploded. Radio stations played it non-stop. Audiences couldn't believe it. That sound, that rhythm, that voice. People asked the same question everywhere. How can a child sing like that? For the first time, the Jackson 5 weren't just a family band from Gary. They were a national phenomenon. Michael was everywhere: magazines, posters, TV shows. But behind the smile in those photos was a child who missed climbing trees, who missed friends, who missed being unseen. He once told a Motown staff member quietly, "Sometimes I just want to go outside and not be Michael Jackson." The man laughed. "Kid, that's never happening again." And he was right. Everywhere the Jackson 5 went, crowds screamed. Girls fainted, cameras flashed, people chased their cars. It was thrilling and terrifying. But the more famous they became, the more Joseph's rules hardened. Don't talk too much. Don't mess up. Don't let them see weakness. Weakness wasn't allowed in the Jackson family, not even for a child. At night, Michael would sit in his hotel room, gazing out at the city lights. He'd hear laughter from other kids playing outside the window, and something inside him would ache. He loved music, but he missed being small. When he tried to tell his father, Joseph cut him off. "You think this is easy? You think people get chances like this every day? You better be grateful, boy. You better earn it." So he stopped talking about it. He learned to keep his feelings inside. That silence became part of him, a quiet armor he carried for the rest of his life. Yet even in that silence, his genius grew. He began studying other performers: James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Diana Ross. He copied their moves, their timing, their emotion, and then made them his own. One day, Berry Gordy watched from the studio window as Michael rehearsed alone, drenched in sweat. He turned to an engineer and said, "That kid, he's not rehearsing, he's becoming." And that was true. Every step, every note, every breath, Michael was transforming. Not just into a star, but into something larger than life. But while the world saw brilliance, Joseph saw business. He negotiated, he controlled, he pushed harder. And behind that control, Michael's childhood quietly disappeared. There were no birthdays, no playgrounds, no school dances, only stages, rehearsals, and flashing lights. At 10 years old, he had lived more lifetimes than most adults ever would. And yet inside, he still felt like that barefoot boy who once trembled on a small stage in Gary. He didn't know it yet. But that same trembling, that mix of fear and wonder, would stay with him forever. Because even though he now stood before thousands of screaming fans, he still felt small. He still felt unseen. And somewhere deep inside, he whispered the same words he had whispered years before. Maybe if I sing better, they'll love me more. Little did he know, the world would love him beyond measure. But the love he needed most would remain just out of reach. By the time Michael turned 12, he was no longer just a singer, and he was a phenomenon. The Jackson 5 dominated the charts. 4 consecutive #1 hits, sold-out tours, television appearances that made audiences scream before he even opened his mouth. The boy who once stood barefoot in fear now commanded entire arenas with a single glance. But for every cheer, there was a shadow. The pressure never eased. If anything, it grew heavier. Motown wanted more records, more tours, more performances. Joseph demanded constant perfection. Don't lose focus, he'd say. People forget fast. Michael began to believe it. That if he stopped for even a moment, everything, the fame, the applause, the love, would disappear. And so he never stopped. He sang through colds, danced through exhaustion, smiled through sadness. His pain became his professionalism. His exhaustion became his art. But beneath the rehearsed smiles, something inside him was changing, hardening. He had seen what fame could do to people. He had seen jealousy turn brothers against brothers. He had seen his father's pride turn to obsession, and deep inside, a question began to form. One he couldn't yet answer. Who am I? When I'm not performing? One evening after a show, Michael sat alone in the dressing room staring into the mirror. The makeup lights glared around him, too bright, too harsh. He leaned closer to his reflection and whispered, I don't even look like me anymore. It wasn't about the face in the glass. It was about the boy inside it. The boy who once sang Barefoot, trembling not for fame but for love. That boy was fading. And the world's Michael Jackson, the icon, the star, the machine, was taking over. But every now and then, that little boy's voice would still whisper through the noise. It came out in his music, in those soft notes of longing, in lyrics about loneliness and innocence. Even as a child star, he was writing songs about isolation, about wanting to be free. No one realized those lyrics weren't poetry. They were confessions. The older he got, the clearer it became. Michael Jackson wasn't chasing fame. He was running from emptiness, and the tragedy was, the faster he ran, the further that emptiness followed. During one quiet car ride, Catherine looked at him and said, You don't talk much anymore, Michael. He smiled faintly. Talking doesn't make people listen, Mama. Singing does. She reached for his hand. But he was already looking out the window, lost somewhere between the city lights and the stars. That night, as the family returned to another show, the crowd was already screaming their name. The energy was overwhelming, banners waving, flashbulbs bursting, people crying just to see them. Michael stood backstage, breathing slowly. He could feel his heart racing. The same rush he'd felt years ago, the same fear that had turned into fire. And just before stepping out, he whispered to himself, Don't be scared. Be magic, the music started. The lights rose, and the little boy from Gary disappeared once more, replaced by the performer the world couldn't look away from. He danced, he sang, he gave everything he had. The crowd roared louder with every move. But when the final note ended and the curtains closed, silence hit him like a wave. The applause faded, and he was alone again. That was the cruel rhythm of fame. The louder the world cheered, the quieter his heart became. Years later, when Michael would speak in rare, unguarded moments, he would mention that silence. He would talk about the boy who once sang barefoot nervous under cheap lights. The boy who didn't know what fame was, only what music felt like, and he would say softly, "That boy never really left. He just got lost somewhere along the way." Because that first stage, that trembling 5-year-old's moment, had created both a legend and a wound. It gave him everything the world could offer, and took away everything the world couldn't give back. The child who once sang to conquer fear had become a man who sang to survive it. And though history would remember his genius, his moves, his magic, Michael himself would always remember something else, that small stage, that barefoot floor, that moment of silence before the applause, the place where he first found his voice and quietly lost himself to it. The curtain closed that night on a child and opened on a legend named Michael Jackson. But somewhere, deep within the music, that barefoot boy is still singing. Not for fame, not for history, but for home. Fame didn't stop when the curtains fell. It only got louder. By the time Michael was 16, the Jackson 5 were household names. Their faces were everywhere. Posters, lunchboxes, magazines, even dolls. The boy who once sang in a tiny community hall in Gary was now the center of a global phenomenon. But behind the applause, something else echoed, a question he could never quiet. Where did the little boy go? The more famous Michael became, the less he recognized himself. Every part of his life was choreographed. Every movement, every word, every smile. He was no longer singing because he wanted to. He was singing because the world demanded it. When the spotlight hit, he became the performer everyone loved. But when it faded, he returned to silence. That same silence he once feared as a child. He'd walk through empty hotel hallways late at night, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls. That echo reminded him of the applause, but it also reminded him of everything he missed: friends, school, birthdays, moments that never had a stage. He once told a journalist, "When you grow up in front of people, you stop growing up inside." That was the quiet tragedy of his youth. He wasn't allowed to make mistakes, to fail, to be ordinary. Every imperfection was corrected, every emotion rehearsed. And slowly, the boy who had once sung barefoot out of pure joy began to vanish beneath the weight of expectation. But deep down, that child never completely disappeared. He lived in the way Michael laughed softly when talking about cartoons. He lived in the way Michael stared up at the stars after long nights in the studio. He lived in the songs Michael wrote about innocence, loneliness, and lost childhood, because even when he sang to millions, his music was always a conversation with that little boy from Gary, the boy who sang to escape fear. One night, during the recording of a new album, Michael asked the producer to dim the lights. He closed his eyes and began to sing softly, almost to himself. The producer watched in silence. It wasn't a take for the record. It was something else. Something private. When the song ended, Michael stayed still for a long time. Then he whispered, "Sometimes I still see that stage, you know? That first one, barefoot, so scared. But that's when I felt most alive." The producer didn't reply. There was nothing to say, because in that moment, the truth hung heavy in the air. Michael Jackson had spent his life trying to return to the one place fame could never take him back to. That little wooden stage where everything began. That night, he sat alone in the studio long after everyone had left. The lights dimmed low, the hum of the equipment surrounding him. He thought about his brothers, scattered now, each living their own version of the dream. He thought about his father, still calling, still managing, still demanding. He thought about his mother, praying for him, reminding him of God when the world forgot he was human. And then he thought about that boy, the barefoot 5-year-old who had no idea what was coming, who sang because it made his mother smile. He smiled faintly. Maybe he was the lucky one, he whispered, because that boy didn't know fear, money, or headlines. He only knew music, pure, simple, honest music. It was the echo of innocence, a sound that fame could imitate but never recreate, and that echo haunted him. It followed him into every arena, every interview, every sleepless night, because no matter how big the crowd got, Michael never stopped looking for that small, quiet moment before the music began. That heartbeat of stillness that reminded him, before the fame, before the noise, before the world, he was just a boy who wanted to sing, and in that search, he created something the world had never seen before, music that wasn't just heard, but felt. Each song became a message to that lost child, each lyric a prayer to be free again. And though he couldn't return to that first stage, he could keep its spirit alive through his art. That was the paradox of Michael Jackson, the man who changed music forever, yet spent his entire life chasing the sound of his own beginning, because sometimes the echo of innocence never fades. It just gets buried under applause. Years later, the world would remember the spectacle, the moonwalk, the magic, the impossible perfection. But those who truly listened could still hear it. That trembling, fragile heartbeat from a 5-year-old boy who once stood barefoot under a dim light. Michael had become something more than famous. He was myth, a living legend whose art transcended borders, race, language, and time. Yet the higher he climbed, the more distant that child inside him became. He built Neverland, not just a home, but a wish to rewind time, to rebuild what he had lost. He filled it with laughter, rides, animals, everything a child could dream of. But the truth was, Neverland wasn't a place for other children. It was a message to one child, himself. Every Ferris wheel light, every melody that played in the background was a whisper to the barefoot boy who never got to grow up. Come back. You can be happy here. You can be free. But innocence, once taken, never truly returns. Michael tried to find it in music. He poured it into Ben, Childhood, Heal the World, and Man in the Mirror. Songs that weren't just hits. They were confessions. Each note carried the longing of a man who had seen everything and still searched for the one thing that couldn't be bought, peace. And even as the world watched him with judgment, love, or obsession, he never stopped giving. Every performance, every lyric, every breath was an offering to the audience, to humanity, and to the child he used to be. He once said softly, "People see the performer, but I still see the 5-year-old scared and barefoot. I sing for him." Those words defined his entire existence, because that first stage wasn't just where his career began. It was where his soul was split, half given to the world, half left behind in Gary, and as his fame grew into legend, that split became permanent. The world got Michael Jackson, the king of pop, but the boy named Michael, the child who sang for love, he stayed behind, forever 5 years old, still barefoot, still nervous, still singing his heart out in a small room filled with family and hope. When the world mourned him years later, millions of candles lit up the night. Fans across continents sang his songs, cried his lyrics, whispered his name like a prayer. And somewhere, in that chorus of grief and gratitude, it felt as if that barefoot boy finally got to rest, because he had done it. He had taken his fear and turned it into music that healed the world. He had turned trembling into triumph, silence into song, pain into beauty. The legend of Michael Jackson wasn't just about fame or perfection. It was about a child's heart that refused to give up, even when the world took everything else away. And that's why decades later people still listen. Not just to the beat, not just to the rhythm, but to the soul beneath it. That voice that still cries out softly from the beginning of everything. Don't be scared. Just sing. Because every note he ever sang, from that first trembling moment at age 5 to the last breath on stage, was part of one long song. A song about courage, about innocence, about the price of greatness. And though history crowned him the king of pop, the truth was simpler, deeper, more human. He was a boy who faced fear, sang through it and changed the world. Even now, when people play his music, the echo of that first stage still lingers. You can almost hear it if you listen closely. a wooden floor creaking, a child breathing nervously, a voice rising, pure and trembling into destiny. The curtain opens, the light hits his face, and the crowd holds its breath. 5 years old, barefoot, terrified, but ready. And from that moment on, the world would never be the same again. Because sometimes, history isn't made by the fearless. It's made by the ones who are afraid, but step onto the stage anyway. The world remembers the moonwalk, the glittering glove, the sold-out stadiums. But before all of it, before Billie Jean, before Thriller, before the myth, there was that one small stage in Gary, Indiana. It was supposed to be just one night. A performance so small it could have disappeared into time, forgotten among millions of childhood memories. But that night never really ended. Because what began as a trembling song from a barefoot child became a ripple that never stopped spreading. When Michael stepped onto that floor, clutching the microphone with both hands, he didn't just perform, he changed the world's rhythm. The fear that almost silenced him became the fire that would fuel him for the rest of his life. Every artist, every performer, every dreamer who ever stood frozen before a crowd, they lived a little through that boy. Because in his voice they heard something universal, the moment when fear meets destiny. And that's why that first performance still echoes through time. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about talent. It was about transformation. The instant a child found courage so deep, it outlived him. Years later, when people asked Michael how he dealt with stage fright, he would smile softly and say, "You never stop being nervous. You just learned to let the music talk for you." But that wasn't modesty. It was a truth carved from that first night, when his trembling became melody. Because on that stage, barefoot and small, Michael Jackson discovered something far greater than applause. He discovered purpose. And purpose, once found, never lets go. But purpose is heavy. It demands everything. For Michael, it demanded his youth, his peace, even his privacy. Every song, every performance, every perfection came from that same fire that first sparked when he was 5. He couldn't stop. Not because he was addicted to fame, but because that boy inside him never stopped singing. That boy still wanted to prove he could make people smile. That boy still wanted to make his mother proud. And so, even as the world turned him into an icon, Michael kept chasing something far simpler, that pure feeling he had the first time the music drowned out his fear. But as the years passed, something strange happened. The world grew louder, but inside, Michael grew quieter. He would spend long hours in his studio, alone with a single light glowing and an old tape recorder humming in the corner. He'd play back old Jackson 5 tracks, his childhood voice filling the room. And sometimes, just sometimes, you could hear him whisper under his breath, "Can you hear him too?" That wasn't nostalgia. It was grief. He wasn't listening to an old song. He was listening for a ghost, the ghost of innocence that began on that tiny stage and was lost somewhere on the road to greatness. The night of his first performance never ended because he never left that stage. He just built a bigger one. Every stadium, every award show, every world tour was an echo of that first night. The same heartbeat, the same nervous breath before the lights hit his face, the same whispered prayer, "Don't let me mess up." That was Michael's truth. The world saw a superstar, but he still felt like a scared boy singing Barefoot for the first time. And maybe that's why he connected with so many hearts. Because even when he stood on top of the world, he never stopped being human. That night didn't make him invincible. It made him real. And that's the part the world almost never understood. When Michael passed away in 2009, millions mourned across continents. Candlelight vigils, songs, tributes, a planet united by grief and gratitude. It was as if the entire world had lost a part of its soundtrack, but in another sense, the music didn't stop. Because that boy, that barefoot dreamer, still sings, through the speakers, through memories, through generations who never even met him. Every time a child stands on a stage, terrified but determined. Every time someone follows their gift despite the odds. Every time fear meets courage, That night lives again, because that was the true legacy of Michael Jackson. Not the moonwalk, not the fame, not even the records. It was the permission he gave the world to believe that something magical can begin from fear. The Barefoot Boy from Gary proved that greatness doesn't come from confidence. It comes from courage, and courage isn't the absence of fear. It's stepping forward despite it. That's why the story of that first performance matters more than all the awards combined. Because that night taught him something the rest of his life would only repeat in bigger ways. The music only lives if the heart is honest. Michael once said, "The greatest education in the world is watching the masters at work." But he forgot something. He became the master people now study. Generations later, artists still chase the same purity that 5-year-old Michael had, that raw, trembling authenticity that came before fame, before expectation, before the walls closed in. When he sang "Who's Loving You" that night, the crowd didn't just hear a child. They heard truth, and truth never grows old. Maybe that's why, no matter how many years pass, his music still feels alive. Because it wasn't made by a superstar. It was born from a scared little boy who refused to give up, and that's the secret nobody tells you about legends. They don't become timeless because they're perfect. They become timeless because their humanity never fades. That first stage, dusty, small, dimly lit, was more than just a performance. It was a prophecy that one day this trembling child would carry the sound of human emotion to every corner of the earth. And even after he was gone, that echo would keep moving, from heart to heart, generation to generation. So when you hear his voice today, in the crackle of a record, in the radio, in a passing car, listen closer. Behind the production, behind the legend, behind the fame, there's still a little boy singing. You can almost hear the wooden floor creak beneath his feet. You can almost feel his tiny hands gripping the microphone. You can almost hear the silence before the first note, that sacred moment when fear turns into faith. And in that instant, the past and present become one. Because Michael Jackson never truly left that stage. He just kept singing from somewhere beyond it. He sang through his pain, through his joy, through his loneliness, through the noise of a world that could never quite understand him. And when the final curtain fell, when the world said goodbye, something beautiful remained. The echo of that first song. Still trembling. Still alive. Still barefoot. That's the part the headlines missed. The child didn't disappear behind the superstar. He powered him. That little boy's courage became Michael's genius. His fear became Michael's rhythm. His heart became Michael's voice. And that's why even now, when people dance to his songs or cry to his lyrics, they're really connecting to something deeper. A child who dared to sing through fear. So maybe, when all is said and done, Michael's story isn't about fame at all. Maybe it's about what happens when one scared child refuses to let fear define him, because that's what changed history. Not the records, not the sales, but that moment, a barefoot boy trembling under a single light who decided to sing anyway. That's the moment that never ends. And if you close your eyes long enough, you can still hear him, soft, high, innocent, breaking through the silence of the world. The crowd holds its breath. The note rises, and suddenly, time stops. Because in that instant, that pure, fleeting, eternal instant, fear dies, and music is born. That's not just how Michael Jackson began. That's how legends begin. Not with confidence, not with certainty, but with one brave voice that says, "I'm scared, but I'll sing anyway." And that is why the curtain never truly closed. Because somewhere, somehow, that little boy is still on that stage. Still barefoot, still trembling, still singing, still changing history.